We could not be more excited to welcome Michael Chabon back to Sixth and Die tonight. He's read here once before, he's read at Politics and Prose twice, so I hope he knows how much we love his work, but I'm going to tell you guys anyway. He's the best. He's the best-selling and Pulitzer Prize-winning author of 8 novels, plus stories, plus kids' books, including Wonder Boys, The Amazing Adventures of Kavalier and Clay, The Yiddish Policeman's Union, and most recently, Moonglow. Moonglow is a novel disguised as a memoir, or a memoir in which, as the author's note says, liberties have been taken with the truth. It's a family story, but has cameos by Alger Hiss, Wild Bill Donovan, a cat-eating boa constrictor, and an overweight squirrel named the Momser, which is a Yiddish insult that, if you don't know, I will not translate for you at this time. But most of all, it's an incredible feat of storytelling, or as Michiko Kakutani said in her glowing New York Times review, it's a demonstration of the magic powers of storytelling to provide both solace and transcendence. So please join me to welcome master storyteller Michael Chabon to Sixth and Die.
Thank you, Lily. Hello, good evening. Thank you. Thank you for coming out on this cold, wet, nasty night. I would not have held it against you if you didn't come. I would have understood, so thank you. I probably said something just like this the last time I was here, but there's just something a little unsettling about just this is so synagogue-y. And I feel like I should be up here saying, like the latke party is going to be 2 weeks from today, and the Sisterhood Mahjong tournament is beginning. Make a few announcements before I ask you for money. And tell you whose car is double parked and about to be towed before we do the mourner's Kaddish. I'm going to read for 4 hours, just because it is a synagogue, so I have to kind of drone on for a while, and then about 20 minutes, and then I'll take questions. I have the questions already. Thank you, those of you who are generous enough with your attention and time to jot some questions down. I really appreciate it. So this book starts a few times in the sense that it's set at a few different periods in its protagonist's life. Is this a good distance from the mic, by the way? Can you hear me? Okay. And so each time period has its own first chapter, if you will. And this is chapter 6, but you're not missing anything really by not having read chapters 1 through 5, because they happen after. My grandfather saw my grandmother for the first time in February 1947 at Ahavas Sholem Synagogue. See, it's thematic. There's a footnote to that, which reads, in its new digs on Reisterstown Road in Pikesville. Ahavas Sholem was among the first of the major synagogues in town to make the move from the pre-war heart of Jewish Baltimore around Park Circle to the suburban wilds beyond 7 Mile Lane. My grandmother had been posed beside a potted palm in a fox stole and sunglasses under a banner that read, "Try your luck!" Exclamation point. The fur was on loan from the president of the sisterhood. The dark glasses had been provided free of charge by the president's husband, an ophthalmologist, to treat a case of photophobia brought on by chronic malnutrition. I assume that the text painted on the bedsheet banner, part of the decor for Congregation Ahavas Sholem's inaugural Night in Monte Carlo, was coincidence. The pose, however, had been calculated with utmost strategy. Without consulting her, the sisterhood had decided that even though she was a widow, encumbered with a 4-year-old daughter, my grandmother, transferred safely to Baltimore from a DP camp in Austria, was the leading candidate for the position of wife to the new rabbi. Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society canteens, and then the kitchens of Park Circle and Forest Park had conspired to ensure that my grandmother regained her shape, her color, and what the president always referred to as that gorgeous head of hair. My grandmother was courteous, conversant with literature and art. She had ambitions and the talent, it was said, to be an actress on the stage. Her feline face and French accent, at times impenetrable, led more than one admirer to compare her to Simone Simon, the star, of course, of The Cat People, the original one, not the bad one. In spite of suffering and loss, she laughed often, smiled easily. She strode into rooms with actressy shoulders and the humble swagger of a girl who had come of age, hidden by hard-working nuns. A few times, it was true, she'd come out with utterances that made no sense whatsoever in French or English. It was also true that when she was not smiling, she fell into taut silences, seemed to listen for footsteps on the other side of the doors, studied shadows in the corners of rooms. When taken to a Baltimore public library for the first time, it was reported, she had made straight for the recordings of Highland reels. Now, the first two peculiarities were put down to being a relative newcomer to English and a girl who had endured and survived the unspeakable. Nobody could account for the love of bagpipes. If one sometimes sensed a weird crackle around her, a scorching like dust on a solenoid, it was believed by the sisterhood and seconded by many of their husbands that this mysteriously added to her allure. The new rabbi, freshly graduated first in his class from the Jewish Theological Seminary, had charmed everyone with his brilliance and elan, his tailored suits, and his faint, delicious odor, unexpected in a rabbi, of gardenias. But he displayed a troubling streak of self-will. All his life, he had been the pride of his family and the joy of his teachers. As a result, he had learned to prefer his own ideas to those of other people, even with regard to subjects such as the woman he ought to marry, about which he could be expected to know very little. Overt matchmaking attempts, each to a thoroughly eligible candidate, had not turned out well. The sisterhood caucused and agreed to authorize the use of wiles. To ensure that the target of the operation could not fail to notice her when he put in his scheduled appearance at night in Monte Carlo, the sisterhood had posed my grandmother beside the rented palm tree just by the main door of the synagogue's reception room. 2 sisterhood members were deployed here to pin my grandmother down. Mrs. Waxman, married to a judge, had been the chief sponsor of my grandmother's petition for refugee status. Mrs. Zellner, among the first Jewish graduates of Bryn Mawr, spoke excellent French. Playing on my grandmother's sense of obligation and her hunger to speak her mother tongue, the women were prepared to hold her on the spot for however long it took the rabbi to arrive, at which point they would merely put my grandmother in his way so that afterward, a key to the strategy, he could operate under the impression that he had discovered his future bride for himself. The rabbi was late. The reception room filled with congregants who knew nothing of the sisterhood's maneuverings and were eager for the evening to begin. The chair of the fundraising committee stepped to the dais. He had prepared a welcome studded with mildly off-color puns about spades and craps. But when the microphone gave him a mild electric shock, he was obliged to break off his speech. The sisterhood president shoved her husband, the ophthalmologist, toward the dais, where the hired musicians, Jews dressed as fanciful Cubans, loitered with their instruments. The ophthalmologist crouched down beside the chairman of the fundraising committee. He took the man's pulse and helped him unbutton his collar. Other male congregants offered assistance in the form of impromptu puns on the words shock, current, spark, and what a revolting development this was, and so forth. That's known as Jewish first aid. The 15-year-old sound technician struggled to locate and swap in a new mic, a task in which he was hampered by his mother's constant reminders that he ought to hurry. A scrum kicked up around the table of dairy appetizers, awakening old antipathies and reinforcing new ones. Meanwhile, the thong of small talk and college French that the sisterhood's tiger hunters were using to lash their goat to its stake stretched ever thinner. A second microphone was found and tested. The board president was certified fit to conclude his speech. Please, he enjoined all those who had come to try their luck that night, lose as much and as often as you possibly can. The lights were lowered. The dance band generated a supper club ambiance. Over the cha-cha-cha, the chatter, and the rattle of dice and roulette balls, my grandmother's handlers found it impossible to maintain their grip on her. She took a package of Herbert Territons from her borrowed beaded clutch. I find it is very warm in this room, she said, still unsuspecting her status as prey, but conscious of the strain on the conversational tether. Excuse me, please. Maybe I will have a look at the beautiful moon. All at once, the moon of Mrs. Zellner's face was suffused with delight. In her relief, she may have tipped her hand slightly. Mais voilà le rabbin, she cried. Every time you see me taking a drink, that means we're switching points of view at this chapter. That's how you'll know. All day, my grandfather had busied himself finding reasons not to accompany Uncle Ray to night in Monte Carlo. He was not ready to mix with regular people. He was uncomfortable making small talk with strangers. He lacked the funds and the appropriate attire. He had no use for synagogues. He would just get in his brother's way. Each of these reasons, with the aplomb of a born dialectician, Uncle Ray discounted, dismissed, disarmed, or batted to one side. He appreciated the challenge a return to civilian life must represent, he said. But in the end, you just had to hold your breath and jump into the pool. Nobody, apart from traveling salesmen and the people who accosted you in bus terminals, was comfortable making small talk with strangers. He would happily stake my grandfather for the evening to be repaid by the winnings or at a later date. He owned a very nice blazer, Harris tweed, that was much too big in the shoulders for him. A synagogue, when you came right down to it, was only a building. Great Jews from Abraham to Hillel had never laid eyes on one. And everyone, by design and almost by definition, was in a rabbi's way. When the time came to leave for the synagogue, the only card my grandfather still held was to make himself disagreeable, pick a fight, and hope to be uninvited. The problem with this approach was Uncle Ray's satisfaction with himself and his opinions. Whatever position you adopted, Uncle Ray alighted on higher ground. Attacks on his person or character could have no basis in fact. The kid just laughed them off. My grandfather hit him with surliness, scorn, wet blanket inertia. Uncle Ray floated effortlessly above it all. But in the parking lot of Ahava Sholem, as they were about to get out of his brother's brand new Mercury coupe, Ray already had his door open. My grandfather, in his desperation to give offense, stumbled at last on a viable approach. Because in the winter of 1947, no one, least of all Uncle Ray, was conscious of the creeping unbelief that afterward began to trouble my great-uncle and ultimately led him to exchange his pulpit for the pool halls and racetracks of Baltimore, Wilmington, and Havre de Grace. My grandfather seemed to have picked up on some early vibration of the crisis to come. From childhood, he had suspected Uncle Ray of faking the whole boy tzaddik thing to gain the attention and approval first of their parents, then of the greater Jewish world. A sibling's ESP guided my grandfather's hand as it reached for the quiver, let fly the shaft. "You don't see the irony," he said. "Night in Monte Carlo. You don't see how disingenuous that is? The whole joint's already a fucking casino, Ray. A sideshow tent. Remember upstairs from Pat's Steak, that crew came in and opened a betting office? Those grifters from Buffalo who fleeced Frank Osterberg? That's you. You're running a wire store, Ray. Taking bets on races you're never going to have to pay off because you already know the result. The marks come in, you take their money. Promise them what? Forgiveness, eternity, a line item in God's account book. Then you just sit back and wait for the blow-off. Give them a few last words of mumbo-jumbo, plant their chump bodies in the ground. It was a long speech for my grandfather, who felt his argument take on more weight and conviction as it carried him along. Uncle Ray eased shut the driver's side door with an angry punctilio. He twisted around in his seat to face my grandfather. His elbow mashed the Mercury's horn. His freckles vanished into the overall redness of his face. "How dare you?" he promisingly began. With that opening horn blast and an encouraging flicker of guilt in his eyes, Uncle Ray mounted to the saddle of his high horse. He cited the humble piety of their long-suffering parents and grandparents, the good deeds and intentions of his congregants, the faithfulness and martyrdom of Jews the world over, the integrity of the rabbinate, the accomplishments of 5,000 years. From there, he moved on to Maimonides, Hank Greenberg, Moses, Adonai. Evidently pleased with the effect it made, he pounded the horn a couple of more times for emphasis. At one point, he grew so heated that his saliva flecked the lapel of the Harris tweed jacket my grandfather had borrowed. But then, having instanced the Lord God of hosts, Uncle Ray paused. He narrowed his eyes. My grandfather, he realized, had offered no resistance or counter-arguments. He just sat there with spider-like patience, letting Uncle Ray rage. "You almost had me," Uncle Ray said. He grew calm, his tone measured. "You are coming in there with me, and you are going to be glad that you did. And do you know how I know you're coming in there with me? How? Because that is the Holy One's plan for you." "Oh, really? God has a plan for me." "About goddamn time." Home a month. My grandfather was out of work, depressed, and scuffling. His college degree had been gathering dust for 6 years. His experience in Europe qualified him for nothing that was legal in peacetime. His Philadelphia homecoming had seemed to disappoint all participants, in particular his parents, whose keenest disappointment lay in discovering that despite the captain's bars and the decorations for actions he could not discuss, they were still disappointed in him. "Everything that's happened to you in your life before now," Uncle Ray said, "was part of the plan. And tonight, it's all going to come together and make sense. You know this." "I do." "God slips you the inside dope." Uncle Ray ran his hand along the tuck and roll upholstery under his thigh, his smooth chin adorned with the minute smirk of a man with a fix in. "Christ, you are so full of it, Ray." "Yeah? So let's make a bet," Uncle Ray said. Only moments after his pious outburst, along the very lines my grandfather had employed to needle him, my great-uncle pointed, unwittingly, toward the exit door through which he and the custom Brunswick pool stick would afterward pass. $500 says you walk into that shul in the first half hour, no, in the first 10 minutes. The Holy One's plan for you will be revealed. The reason you needed to show up tonight. "What horse shit," my grandfather said. "Brother, you are on." His discharge pay had been snarled in red tape, and he didn't have anything close to $500, but he figured you had to like his odds. Very good. My grandmother turned toward the doors of the reception room, curious to see the new crowned princeling of Jewish Baltimore. She caught a glimpse of a slender young man in a navy blazer with buttons like gold coins. Under a velvet yarmulke, also navy blue, he wore his ginger hair half an inch too long. Entering the room, he was mobbed by a group of men, among them Judge Waxman, who teased and fussed over him like uncles ushering a virgin nephew into a brothel. The rabbi was soon lost from view. Mrs. Waxman coughed up a Yiddish imprecation or description of what lay in store for her husband when they got home. "I don't know," my grandmother heard the rabbi say. He was making a show of reluctance, letting the men pull him by the wrists into the room. "Gentlemen, I have my doubts." As he was swept, redolent of gardenia, past my grandmother, she heard him apologizing for his tardiness. "It wasn't my fault," he said. "Blame my date." "The brother," Mrs. Zellner said. She sounded doubtful of the identification, as if the visible facts did not conform with what she had been told. "A decorated war hero." My grandmother saw my grandfather lingering in the hallway outside the reception room, looking as if he harbored doubts far graver than his brother's. He kept his hands straitjacketed so fiercely in his pockets that they had begun to pull open the fly of his trousers. His knit necktie was ill-knotted, and his brown tweed blazer, worn over a chambray shirt that needed ironing, was too tight at the shoulders. Everything, the music, the lights, the rattle of wheels and dice, the outbursts of joy or disgust from the tables, his clothes, his skin, seemed to fit the man too tightly. Only his eyes had found a way to escape. They leaped to my grandmother from the hollows of his face as though from the windows of a burning house. He could stand a little more decoration, said Mrs. Waxman. For all the resistance he had put up to attending that evening's event, my grandfather had given no thought to what it would be like when he got there. It was worse than he could have imagined. Night in Monte Carlo, a sequined half moon, swags of 10-watt stars, paper carnations and potted palms, all carted in to cloak machinery that had been rigged to grind everyone down to zero sooner or later. To my grandfather, post-war, it seemed a ham-fisted synopsis of the world as he had come to understand it. He sidled a little way into the room, hands stuffed into the pockets of his workman's pants, feeling fit for nothing. He lowered his head to avert his eyes from the gaudiness and blare, the unseemliness of his unscathed homeland and countrymen, the unseemliness of Baltimore and its 30,000 well-fed Jews. The girl in the black dress walked right up to him. He had not spoken to a desirable woman who was not at some level his enemy or a whore since 1944. I was not ready for her, he told me. I was totally unprepared. She was wearing sunglasses indoors at night. Around her shoulders, the remains of what had been a fox sank its teeth into itself. She came confidently, but hedging a little, head cocked to one side, as if only 85% certain they had met before, and prepared to acknowledge her mistake. Between the fox stole and the bateau neck of the cocktail dress on loan from the board president's daughter, blazed an inch of bare white collarbone. My grandfather heard Mrs. Waxman and Mrs. Zellner disconsolately calling after my grandmother as she bridged the final 20 feet of linoleum mock parquetry that separated him from her. He registered the tick-tock oscillation of her hips, the amplitude of the curves divulged by the cut of the taffeta dress. During the war, he had come to depend on his pool hustler's gift for taking rapid readings of other people's eyes, and her sunglasses unnerved him. They struck him as unlikely. He wondered if she was in costume, starring later in a skit or pageant on the theme of Night in Monte Carlo. He surprised himself by smiling, which unnerved him further. The girl's lips were painted red as bicycle hearts and diamonds, and they parted to reveal an Ingrid Bergman smile to go with the sunglasses. There's a footnote to that. It says, her teeth had been painstakingly reconstructed with the compliments of a Liberty Heights dentist who afterward retired to Florida, where he turned up at a reading I gave one night at Books and Books in Coral Gables to tell me that he never entirely recovered from the shock of the ruin he found inside my grandmother's mouth. My grandfather heard a sound inside his head that he compared years later to the freight train rumble of an earthquake. He felt he was standing in the path of something fast-moving and gigantic that, in its blindness, was bound to carry him away. Swept off his feet, he thought. This is that. At the last moment, he managed to return his gaze to his shoe tops and shook his head. Unbelievable, he said, aware that he was still smiling and that he owed his brother $500. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you very much. Okay, let's see. What do we got here? I always like to look for hostile ones first. I can just tell by the handwriting. Please consider. On a visit to Hebron, you were quoted as calling the Israeli occupation, quote, the most grievous injustice I have ever seen in my life. Really? Or was this just hyperbole? It's a two-part question. Really? Let's consider if that seems like a questionable statement. First of all, you have to consider how many grievous injustices have I really seen, like with my own eyes, in my lifetime. So, it's not like I'm going around the world seeing grievous injustices and like ranking them, and you know what I mean? It's not, there's no mathematical formula involved here, and of course I walk past grievous injustice all the time when I'm walking down an inner city street in all parts of this country, but this was just a pretty, like a rough assessment, like a rough guess on my part, and I think, yeah, it's pretty close to the most grievous injustice I've ever seen in my lifetime. I'll stand by that. I'm not exaggerating. It is an offense against humanity, in my opinion. Thank you. You also said that readers who disagree with you could, quote, go away and never come back. Really? Where do I get a refund? Now, see, I didn't say you got a refund. I just said you could go away. I didn't say I will refund you your money. Just go away and never come back. The more pressing question is, where would you go? I'm not really sure, but you'll figure it out. Let's see. That 11-page sentence in Telegraph Avenue. Thank you. What inspired you to write it? What obstacles did you face along the way? Periods. Those are the big obstacles. If you haven't read that book, I won't assume everyone's read that book, so I'll keep it short, but that book has a lot of characters, it has a lot of plot lines, they're kind of all going at the same time, and around the midpoint of the book, sort of all the elements are in play in the sense that the son that one character has never recognized or really acknowledged that he has returned, and the threat to the existence of this record store is clear, and to the midwifery practice, everything's kind of going, and I think I just had a sort of authorial moment of like, where is everybody? How's everyone doing? What state are they in? And various people have moved out on their husbands and so on. So I had this urge to assess the state of my characters, and I think I just probably had this initially an impulse to wish I could almost do like a Robert Altman style kind of tracking shot, a single continuous shot where I checked in on all the characters, and just that initial thought led me very quickly to realize I already had a parrot in this book, a parrot named 58, and it just seemed to me like I was already thinking bird's eye view, and it all just came together, and I thought, okay, I'm just going to have this parrot sort of fly over all my characters in an attempt to escape, a successful attempt to escape, I might add, and just let the parrot sort of stitch all the characters together. And because I was thinking of that continuous, that tracking shot kind of thing, you know, opening of Touch of Evil or that kind of thing, I just thought, okay, I'll try to do a tracking shot in a sentence by not cutting. It seemed like it would be a fun thing to try to do. I've always enjoyed really long sentences. Of course, you know, the last sentence in Ulysses, which is one of my favorite books, was a big inspiration to me. The Molly Bloom soliloquy sentence, which I think is like 4 sentences. William Faulkner tried it. I don't really like his really long sentence in The Bear, I think it is. But still. And yeah, no, periods were the thing. I had made this, I set myself the further challenge of not leaning too heavily on semicolons as fake periods. And so there are semicolons, but there are only a few, maybe 4 or 5 of them in that whole 11-page sentence. So, but I also I didn't want the reader to get so lost in clauses separated by commas. So, you know, I think there are a lot of people out there that didn't enjoy reading that long sentence, but I ignored them. And I look at the number, a lot of people who told me they didn't even notice that was one sentence until somebody told them about it, and then they're like, no, that's not right. My book had proper punctuation, and then like go back and they see that in fact, it's just one big sentence. Where did the title Moonglow come from? This is something I didn't even really quite think about until, this is only the second time someone's asked me this, but I typically will listen to music while I'm writing. And I have go-to music that works irrespective of what project I'm working on. The music typically has to be sort of dynamically even, like not really loud parts and really soft parts. It can't have lyrics, or at least not intelligible lyrics. So like Steve Reich, actually music for 18 musicians, if you know that piece, that's like the perfect piece of music for me. But then sometimes I also use music to set this mood for me, to get me in the mood. And that really began, both listening to music while working and using it to set a mood, both began with The Amazing Adventures of Kavalier and Clay, where I listen to a lot of big band swing to just, and that kind of music still to this day, all I have to do is listen to some like Glenn Miller or Artie Shaw or something, and I have this overwhelming sense of being transported into the time that the music was recorded, which was 20 or more years before I was born, 25 years. Still works. And so when I started work on this book, and I realized I was in the same roughly mid-century kind of element, and that my main character was definitely a man of that period, I thought, I'm gonna just put a little Benny Goodman trio and quartet music on just to get me in the mood. And the song, his version of Moonglow, is on the recording I have. And it just, as soon as I love that song, and as soon as I heard it, I just felt like this is how I want reading this book to feel the way listening to this song feels. It's wistful. It invokes the past. It has a kind of quiet poignance to it. It's also hot in a way because the playing is so incredibly. I mean, he had those quartets with Lionel Hampton and Teddy Wilson and Gene Krupa. Anyway, they were amazing. So I don't know. There's a technical precision to it. Everything. I just thought, okay. And then I thought, well, maybe the way to get myself to remember that that's what I'm going to do is I'll just call this Moonglow, and that will always be there as a reminder of what I'm going for. And so I titled the book Moonglow just like that, with no real thought of why I was calling it Moonglow. And then everything else there's a lot of moon in this book. You heard some tonight with the paper moon and the so on. It all emerged from that decision about using this song to be the title. Let's see. What do we got? Oh, here's one about the parrot. Dear Mr. Chabon, everyone, DC is a big parrot town, I think. It's known for that. By the way, I was born here. I was born in Georgetown Hospital. My dad went to Anacostia High School. My mom went to Blair. Blair. And I grew up in Columbia. This is definitely my neck of the woods. So I know from parrots in DC, I know. Many people don't know the baseball team was originally called the Parrots before it was the Senators. That's not true. But thanks for all the great writing. What is the fate of 58? That's the parrot after Cochise. Well, that's a spoiler. I can't say that. But what is the fate of 58? 58, the most popular microphone, not called Shure 57. I don't know for sure. I mean, when we last see 58, he seems to be living the ideal life for a parrot. There's a famous colony of escaped wild parrots in San Francisco. Somebody wrote a book about that. You might have read it, The Parrots of Telegraph Hill or something like that. But there is actually a little escaped wild parrot colony in Berkeley too, or so I have been told. And I went to try to see the parrots where they supposedly hang out. I didn't actually see any parrots, but apparently there's like I want to say a loquat tree or some kind of tree that they like the fruit of, and so when parrots escape in the East Bay, they all gravitate toward this one part of Berkeley, and that's where we last see 58, but you never know, because he is the parrot in the book I wrote called The Final Solution. In that book, he's called Bruno, and that book takes place a good 40 or 45 years before Telegraph Avenue, but as you probably know, African gray parrots live a very long time, and that's the same parrot. So he may turn up again at some other era in his life. He's like Wolverine in X-Men comics. Except, he doesn't have a healing factor, but he can speak more intelligently. Okay, let's see. What does the cover logo signify? Well, it's a cover design. Those are matches. Is that not clear? Those are matches? I didn't do it, so if it's not clear, it's not. Initially, this is a beautiful cover by Adalise Martinez, who is a very just shockingly young person who works at HarperCollins, and I believe this is only the second cover she's had. She's had designs she's done, but this was the second one that got chosen for a book. And her first one, I forget the book it was on, but it was chosen for one of the best book cover designs of the year last year. And this one I just found out was chosen for one of the best book cover designs of the year this year. So she's 2 for 2. And but when she first presented it, I had just I'm very lucky that HarperCollins consults me about the covers, and I'm very interested in design, and I have a lot of ideas, and in fact, if they would let me, I would design my own cover. If I insisted on it, they would probably let me, but I won't insist on it because I'm not a professional, and I couldn't have done something so beautiful. But when she first presented it, it was in response, I had just said something kind of mid-century-ish in feel, like the New Directions paperbacks that Alvin Lustig designed in the 50s, or or like a Saul Bass kind of feel. I gave really broad guidelines. I didn't want it to be pastiche or anything, just to sort of evoke that period. And when she first presented it, it was just bars, just the red bars, and it looked really cool. But it also sort of felt like it might be, it could be a cover for any book. It was a beautiful design, but it didn't really tell you anything about the book. And so I suggested, they almost look like matchsticks. Could they be matchsticks? And I don't know what exactly I was thinking, but this was exactly what I meant. And there's fire in the book. There's one terrible fire no one is hurt, but it really alters the course of the family's life forever. And then there's a cigarette lighter that's an important thing in the book, and there's a lot of fire in the book. And the book is about to a large degree, passion. Both explosive, intense passion, and also a kind of long, smoldering, long-lived passion, and both of those take place within the framework of one marriage between two people. And that's a main theme of the book, so anyway. And like a book of matches. Sort of. Jewish first aid. How am I doing? Great. Maybe 2 more questions. Let's see. Did your grandfather really fight in the war? I had 2 grandfathers, unlike most people. Neither of them fought. They were both, well, one was too old. My father's parents were old parents, especially for the time. I think his mother was 40 when she had him, and that was in 1938. There was a stillbirth before him, but his father would have been too old, and my mother's father had 3 children. He had 2 children. When the war started. Anyway, he had children. He was a lawyer. He wasn't the person they were going to call up right away. And in fact, he did something for the government during the war. I'm not really sure what, but not like secret work. However, I had an uncle, a great uncle, my mother's brother, Uncle Stanley Werbo, and he served in Army intelligence during World War II. He spoke fluent German. He, in fact, after the war, he became a scholar of German. He was a professor of medieval German at the University of Texas, and he spoke just beautiful, fluent German, and he also spoke beautiful, fluent Yiddish. And he was to some degree, the inspiration for the career and the character of the grandfather in my book. He was even more directly the inspiration, though, for the childhood episodes, which are pretty brief in this book, but just before he died, my Uncle Stanley, he dictated some memories to his daughter. They knew he was not going to be around that much longer, and he just sort of rambled into a tape recorder, but he was such a literate, such an intelligent and funny man, and his memories were very precise and very detailed and very evocative, and he grew up in South Philly, and here, and a little bit in Richmond. And, it was so rich and evocative, and it reminded me so much of him. And after he died, his daughter sent me this typed up document. And when I started to write this novel, and I knew I needed to invent a childhood for this grandfather, I used my Uncle Stanley's childhood as the basis for the grandfather's childhood in this book. And so he was really formative in those 2 respects, to the portrait of the grandfather and to this whole novel. And what's surprised me when I realized it, and I was thanking him in the acknowledgments of this book, posthumously, obviously, it was that he also, when I wrote an essay a long time ago now that was published in a magazine that no longer exists called Civilization Magazine. That was the magazine of the Library of Congress. And I wrote this essay about a book called Say It in Yiddish, a phrase book for travelers. And I thought it was funny too. I thought it was poignant and funny and inexplicable, and then people would say, well, Crown Heights. I'm like, who takes a phrase book to Crown Heights? Can you just imagine? Plus, like all phrase books for travelers, it's just intrinsically funny because it's got all these phrases like, help, I need a tourniquet. Which I just love trying to imagine someone whose, arm has been severed by a turbine, and they're like, wait, just hold on. So I wrote this essay speculating about the author's intentions, and then trying to imagine places you might have been able to use, because this was published in 1958 originally, still in print. It's still a big seller. I think it might be the best selling, and it's a whole series, like Say It in French, Say It in Swahili, Say It in Norwegian, and I think of all the Say It books, somebody told me it's the best selling one, but so I tried to imagine a few possibilities. What if Israel, what we now think of as Israel, had chosen Yiddish to be the national language and not Hebrew, there were people that wanted that and argued on behalf of that. They were crushed, but it could have happened. Or what if there were one of these many alternate Jewish homelands had been created, proposed alternate Jewish homelands in Africa, in Australia, or in Alaska, and I referenced this real-life proposal that had been floated by Harold Ickes, FDR's Secretary of the Interior, to allow Jewish refugees into the then Alaskan territory. What if that had happened? And so that became the germ of, but I didn't know it at the time, of Yiddish Policemen's Union. And then, of course, the last thing was, well, what if there hadn't been a Holocaust? And what if there were the 6 million and all the other millions that went elsewhere after the war, or whatever the remnant was? What if they stayed there and they had children, and those children had children, and so on? There'd be all of these, presumably, there'd be big Yiddish-speaking swaths of Europe, where you might take a phrase book like that. And I didn't really, my big sin, and in my view, and what I got in trouble with, what I got in trouble for was that the authors of this phrase book were a married couple named Beatrice and Uriel Weinreich. And Uriel Weinreich in particular was a kind of viewed as a sort of lost opportunity for Yiddish, in that he was this incredibly brilliant scholar of Yiddish, and his father was the founder of YIVO, and a lot of people's hopes had sort of, I gather, come to rest in him after the war, and then he died very young, like at age 40. And so, but I knew none of that. I had no idea who these people were, and I think that my sort of Kavalier attitude toward these, what were they thinking, the Weinreichs, I said in this essay. It offended people. Now, I didn't know any of that because the people it offended were Yiddishists, and I didn't know any Yiddishists, and I didn't really know where they hung out. But it turned out they hung out at this place online called Mendele, which was like a user group or a listserv, or one of those things we don't have anymore, really. I know we still have them, but nobody goes to them. Anyway, this whole flap arose on Mendele, and people were really upset, and a few people defended me, but most people were just heaping contumely and scorn upon my head. And if you speak Yiddish, you have very effective weapons for doing that. And that would have all remained totally unknown and opaque to me, except Uncle Stanley, who was the scholar of German and Yiddish, and also had a really mischievous sense of humor, a puckish sense of humor, told me. He sent me an email saying, well, you've caused quite a flap in the Yiddish teacup, a tempest in the Yiddish teacup, or something like that. And that was and then I went online and I saw this stuff, and he enjoyed it. He was very proud of me, no doubt, and he was proud of my writing and all of that, but I think he also thought maybe I had sort of, he wasn't offended, but I think he enjoyed just seeing what happened. I think he was the kind of person who just enjoys tempests in teacups. And it was in response to that flap and my experience of it that I wrote at Yiddish Policemen's Union, because I both felt like, okay, my ignorance, which led me to offend. I didn't care about people who were offended because they thought I was making fun of Yiddish, because I knew that I wasn't, and I didn't care about people that were offended for other reasons. But when people said, you're doing a dishonor to these great, important scholars, I took that seriously, and I was really embarrassed that I had no idea who they were. So partly out of that sense of wanting to alleviate my ignorance, which is my motivation for doing almost everything in life, honestly. But also because I sort of wanted to just, it's afsaluchas is what you'd say in Yiddish. I wanted to, like, oh, really? This essay offended you? Well, how would you like an entire novel set in a Yiddish-speaking district of Alaska? That's afsoluchus, it's like out of spite. There's a combination of chagrin, remorse, and spite, which is a classic Jewish cocktail. But that was Uncle Stanley. Like, without Uncle Stanley, there's no Yiddish Policemen's Union, and without this book, there's no Yiddish Policemen's Union, and I didn't really realize that until after I had finished that book, so I probably should have dedicated it to him. I thanked him really profusely in the acknowledgments, and the book is dedicated to them, by which I just mean everyone, except people who want a refund. No, all my ancestors, all the people of that generation who are really my ancestors. And with that, I'd like to just say thank you very much. I enjoyed speaking to you immensely. I will be signing. Thank you.